Okay, this story is about how the war ended in regards to being a prisoner of war. We had ended up in a prison camp, Sandbostel, a concentration camp, and there was a few Americans in this camp and a lot of political prisoners, and it was a pretty bad camp. Every morning when I shaved, there was a little railway ran.
What time? Little railway
Ran along beside the fence, about 30 feet away from where this area where we washed and shaved in the morning was. It was an outside place, and it was like little ore cars that were full of dead bodies that they gathered up during the night, or rather gathered up in the morning of people that had died during the night. And it went by, and for the first few weeks, of course, it affected you a lot, but gradually you got used to it, like legs and arms sticking out. And this little railway ran to just outside the camp, where there was a great big pit where the ore cars would tip and the bodies would fall into the pit, and they'd throw some lime on it, and that was it. In a period of about 6 weeks, there was about 10 or 15,000 died. Anyway, this was in April 1945. The Germans decided that if the Allies broke through, and the Allies were getting close at this time, they did not want us to be caught in that camp. So they marched us about 40 miles to a better camp. I think it was 29B. And during that march, I don't remember too much because I was very sick with jaundice and had a hard time keeping up. But it was very important to keep up, because if you fell by the wayside, there was a good chance they would just shoot you, because they didn't want any stragglers. Anyway, I made it, and we got to this camp, in which we were later freed. We were only in that camp about 2 weeks, and there was a lot of action going on. There was Tiger Cub planes floating overhead, which was directing artillery for the British 51st Division, and part of this division was called the Desert Rats. They'd been in the desert and fought their way all through desert and part of Italy, and now had been transferred into Europe, into Germany. And when they got quite close to the camp, they had to be very careful, because they couldn't use the artillery anymore in case they killed a lot of us. So they had to take the camp very carefully with just rifle and machine guns. And when one morning we got up and the Germans were starting to fall back, they fell back not too far, about half a mile into a woods, and they set up their mortars and started to plaster the British 51st Division, which 51st Brigade rather. It was made up of the Coldstream Guards and the Scots Guards, and I think the Sutherland Highlanders, I think. Not sure of the 3rd Regiment that made up that brigade, but they were the ones that actually freed us. And when the first one into the camp was a scout car, came with the captain from the Scots Guards and his driver, and they brought in some cards from the Red Cross, which which then brought a pen in, a pencil rather. And unfortunately, he only had one pencil, so we had to take turns using that pencil and fill out the card, and he was going to take it back and send it right through to the Red Cross to inform our relatives that we were still alive, because from January, when we left 2D, we had never had any contact with anybody in the march right across the top of the along by the Baltic Sea, when we marched right across the top of Germany to Lubeck. And so while I was waiting for a pencil, I was leaning against the hut and listening to this Scots Guard officer who had mentioned that they'd had 3,300 replacements in their regiment, which was enough for over nearly 4 regiments, actually, casualties they'd had from the desert on. And so that regiment had sure seen a lot of action. To have 3,300 replacements, as a regiment is roughly about 900 men. Anyway, waiting for this pencil, the Germans lobbed in a bunch of mortars, and which happened to kill a few men in some huts down a piece from ours, and one of the a piece of shrapnel went right into the hut, right over my head where I was standing. So I decided I wasn't going to sign any card, because the last thing I wanted my mother to receive a card that I was okay and then find out later I'd been killed. So I tore up my card and said, well, when I get back, that'll be it. When I get to England, I'll send her that I'm alive. But that was the first taste of freedom we had, seeing that Scots Guard officer and his driver. By the next day, they had come and taken over most of the camp, and we watched a movie that the Coldstream Guards had brought up for them, and it had. I remember this movie was called Getting Gertie's Garter with Dennis O'Keefe, but they used one of the huts and put blankets over the windows so that the room would be dark. But there was so much shells landing that the blankets were flapping around, and it was kind of hard to sit watching a movie with all that bombing going on. However, we sat through it and saw the movie, and it was the first movie I'd seen in over 3 years. We were told that they would get us out of that camp as fast as possible. There was some complications. They didn't have any food, so they suggested that we went scrounging around the neighborhood there to see if we could get any food at some of the farms nearby, until we got our chance to be driven to this airport and flown into Brussels. And when we were out looking for food, we had to be very careful of mines, because some of the prisoners had got killed scrounging for food by stepping on a mine. But so we got from the one of the officers of the Coldstream Guards an area that we should be. There was no German soldiers, and that we should be able to go out there and maybe find some food and without getting killed. And as we were going up this road, we came across a couple of Coldstream Guard men down at a ledge, just in a small creek. And they were waving at us to get down, because we were just walking upright along the road. As just a couple of 100 yards away was a bunch of Germans in this woods. So we had to detour and go back and look in another area. We didn't get much. We got a few turnips and a few potatoes, and that's about all we were able to get. But that kept us going until we got onto that plane into Brussels, where we were well fed again. And that's the story of the last few days of captivity for me.